This is your Lead Left podcast for the week of December 4th. I'm Randy Schwimmer. Welcome back. Why is private credit getting called out for potential bubbles and systemic risk when banks have been the ones failing? We posed that question to Van Hesser, the chief strategist for KBRA. Mr. Hesser produces a weekly podcast, Three Things in Credit. His October conversation about private credit, capital markets, and the economy caught our attention. It's a reflection of what's new, he told us in our latest Private Capital Call podcast. Post-GFC regulators very successfully de-risked the banking system. We've seen a lot of capital coming into private capital markets over the past decade or so. The rush of money into that space gives some pause as they try to figure out, is this a good or a bad thing? We think this is a positive evolutionary step in the financial system. It takes the risk out of the hands of the 12 or so largest global banks who cede control of their decision-making to regulators in times of stress. You've pushed and diffused that risk across the globe into 1,000 institutional investors. That's a much better shock absorber. The other thing we like, Hesser continued, is you get out of short-funded banks with illiquid long-term assets and move them to a more prudent funding framework with long-term locked-up money holding those assets. That's a real improvement that will dampen the volatility of the credit cycle. We'll need to see this through a cycle, and it doesn't mean there isn't riskier lending out there. It just means in a much better place and funded in a much better way. What about public credit, such as broadly syndicated loans and high-yield bonds? Critics look at higher default rates in those markets and suggest things will be worse for private credit. The wisdom of crowds cuts both ways, he said. Even in the investment-grade markets, if they get a whiff of China slowing or the Fed hiking rates, particularly at dealer desks, which are a lot smaller than they used to be relative to the markets they support, the public markets can be quite volatile around headlines. Private credit isn't going to be affected by every zig and zag. You are long-term lenders in there, ready and willing and able to work with borrowers to ride out their business over a long period of time. That is fundamentally different than the public market, and all its wisdom is willing to treat the BSL market. It's apples and oranges. We want to be aware of what markets are telling us, but you have to be careful about taking that signal and applying it blindly to the private markets. They're really different. You can extend that comparison to default rates, we suggested. The behavior of publicly traded loans with no financial covenants is not the same as illiquid loans with covenants. 12 to 18 months ago, Hesser said, there was a broad consensus we were headed into a recession, and recessions aren't good. Recessions cause 10% default rates in leveraged loans, and why is this one going to be any different? Well, we learned in 2023 why this one was different. Reporting from the Shock Absorber Department at the Lead Left, this is Randy Schwimmer, wishing you and your families a safe and healthy week.